The Syrian president says that the U.S., Britain, France, and Turkey continue to support terrorists in his country. Bashar al-Assad made the remark in an interview with a French magazine. Assad accused the three Western countries of violating international law under the pretext of supporting Kurds. He noted the presence of French forces in Syria is tantamount to occupation. Assad also accused Ankara of trying to blackmail Europe over the issue of extraditing terrorists. Now, he said Syria's war against terrorism has not ended despite significant gains and the country's army has achieved, or that the country's army has achieved, pardon. And now joining us for this news review is George Samuel, the Senior Research Fellow at Global Policy Institute, joining us from Budapest, and Jason Unruhe, political commentator and analyst, joining us from Ontario. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program here. Now, if I could, Jason, I guess we'll start with you over there in Canada. Your thoughts on Assad's remarks?
Well, I think that there's certainly valid criticisms that can be made. His remarks certainly do reflect the way things are right now. I think it's been no surprise that this has been a plot from the beginning by the imperialist powers in the world, particularly those of the United States, the UK, Israel, and to some degree Saudi Arabia, who have been plotting to overthrow the Syrian government. I mean, these kinds of movements don't just simply appear overnight, well-armed, supplied, and attacking the government. I mean, any accusation that this is anything but an attempt to overthrow Assad is torn aside by the catchphrase that began all this by the United States: Assad must go. Now, the U.S. lost its main pretext for being involved in the country, and that is largely the removal of ISIS from the country. And now what remains after Trump pulled the support for the Kurds out of the country, now the U.S. needs a justification for going back in order to protect the oil wealth inside the country, to hold it for the imperialist powers. And that's what this is about. So this move to send forces into the country without the permission of the Syrian government is definitely, to protect the Kurds, is certainly an excuse that is being used in order to carry out an illegal occupation of the country. I mean, this kind of situation going down in Syria is not new to this conflict. There have been other foreign forces illegally occupying the country before. It's just that in this particular situation, it is the Kurds that are being used as a justification inside this situation, a situation that should be rightfully denounced.
And George, if I could, please get your initial thoughts on this.
Yes, I think President Assad made some very pertinent observations. He clearly pointed out that the Western powers, chiefly France, the United States, the United Kingdom, are indeed illegally occupying Syria. And therefore, their pretense that they're somehow fighting terrorism is bogus. If they were really fighting terrorism, then they should have cooperated with the Syrian authorities in order to fight ISIS. They never did so. So therefore, it's a completely dishonest enterprise by saying, well, we're in Syria in order to fight ISIS. Well, you know, there's already a fight against ISIS going. Why don't you join that? So obviously, this is utterly dishonest. And then the other issue that he raised was the business of the terrorists. What happens to the terrorists? As if somehow it's his responsibility to address, with this, with the French terrorists. Well, are you going to release them? Are you going to imprison them? Are you going to send them back to France? Well, he says, look, we will act against them in accordance with Syrian law. I mean, if they have committed crimes here, we will try them here and we will imprison them there. And he contrasted that with Turkey's attitude, because Turkey is using these imprisoned terrorists as a way of blackmailing the West by saying, well, we're just going to release them on you. We will just send, these hundreds of horrific murderers and cutthroats. We'll just dump them on you if we don't get what we want. And I think that's, he's drawing a sharp contrast between his responsible approach based on law with Turkey's gangsterish approach.
And George, how long do you see these countries staying on Syrian soil, and can the country actually, experience peace and stability and have a national committee and constitution if it has so much foreign elements staying there in Syria?
Well, that's a very good question. On the question of reconstruction, there is no way in the world that any of the Western powers will be providing one penny of reconstruction assistance. Having destroyed this country, having inflicted untold misery on the people of Syria, these countries don't have the decency just to cough up a little bit of money towards reconstruction aid. So that's out of the question. Lifting sanctions is also out of the question. They're not going to lift sanctions. The Western powers have been so humiliated by this Syrian adventure that they're just not going to give the Damascus government anything. The question of how long they're going to stay is a little more difficult to decide, because I'm not at all sure that they have the military capability of extracting the oil and shipping the oil out. If the Syrians get fed up with it and start attacking these Western forces, preventing them from extracting the oil, then they would have to make a serious decision. Do they really want to make a major commitment in Syria to stay in Syria just to get the oil out, or are they just better off to clear out? Because as things stand, this isn't really a viable long-term military option, staying in Syria to get the oil out.
And Jason, I want to put that question to you. Why are we seeing this prolonged stay by the West? Are they trying to take over Syria, divvy up Syria, plunder Syria? Your thoughts on this?
I think it's definitely a plot to plunder Syria. The initial plot of trying to overthrow the government has certainly failed. After all these years of war, there has been no significant step forward in trying to eliminate the government. Most of the terrorist forces have been destroyed in the country. So this is about occupying the oil fields and stealing the energy resources of the country. And not only is it tremendously in the profit motive interest of many of the oil companies within the imperialist countries to have this access to resources, but it also serves to undermine the Syrian government as well. A significant portion of its government revenue would certainly come from the reconstruction of the oil industry inside the country, even possibly tapping even more into the market. Now, with this eliminated, this makes things much more difficult for the Syrian government in order to function, because it would be a very important source of revenue. And this, in turn, would have the effect of undermining the government, limiting much of its ability to rebuild. Badly needed funds would be used in that direction. So I think it's a double hit. One, to make money off of oil, and two, to further hinder the anti-imperialist struggle of Syria itself.
And Jason, it's funny because all the accusations the West has made against Assad and his alleged mistreatment of his people, here they are openly saying that they're in there to take the people's money.
Yeah, that's a very common excuse that's given to occupy many of the countries in the world who have resisted U.S. or in general imperialist power and control. The U.S. is certainly no one to ever speak on human rights grounds, considering the damage that they've done to, frankly, the entire world, not just the 1.5 million Iraqis that was listed by Bashar al-Assad, but probably the tens of millions of Latin Americans and countless people around the world. So any idea that the U.S. cares about human rights or people suffering is simply facetious.
And George, your final thoughts on this?
Well, I think that the question will arise is how long can America really maintain this ridiculous presence in Syria solely for the purpose of stealing Syria's oil? It's a serious military venture once the Syrian government decides to put an end to it, because they're not going to put up with this indefinitely. No country is going to put up indefinitely with somebody just parking the bus in the country and just taking the oil out. And at that moment, it's a real question, what is the United States going to do? I suspect the United States will eventually have to decide that they have to get out, because it's too complicated, it's too difficult, it's too dangerous, and
it's too illegal.
goal, yeah, and illegal, and the goal is just so embarrassing that I find it difficult to believe that the United States can maintain this in the long term.